Two graphic novels that I've chosen to compare today are Auschwitz by Pascal Crotchy and Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Auschwitz is a historical fiction set in one of the darkest times of history. It is illustrated in black and white to reflect the feeling of a historical documentary. Frankenstein, on the other hand, is a gothic fantasy that bridges the mortal world with the supernatural. It is action packed and colorful to build an entertaining and suspenseful story for the reader. When analyzing the two authors' writing techniques, we begin to see similarities and differences. I will start with the book Auschwitz. The story begins with a new arrival of Jews in Auschwitz and shows their horrific life and death in Europe's largest concentration camp. Crotchy develops a very somber tone throughout the novel to depict the reality of the camps. From the actual plotline to the drawing of each character, every detail is purposely defined to emphasize the tone. What stood out to me the most is his use of systematic panels and gutters, like a black and white reel from an old film, in which he illustrates his novel. Very rarely does he bleed an image onto another. The illustrations appear almost formulaic to replicate the sense of order in the camps. Concentration camps were notorious for being highly efficient. With only a few thousand soldiers, they were able to control over 1 million prisoners. The white gutters also bring on a feeling of emptiness. Crotchy deliberately avoids using overlapping panels and frames to excite the reader. Instead, the bland and monotony of the frames and gutters resemble the true nature of the camp, the mass destruction of the Jews. However, when we compare the illustrations to Frankenstein, we see an almost entirely different stylish technique. Set 200 years ago, the story shows the rise and fall of Victor Frankenstein and his monster. In the novel, we see images spontaneously bleeding onto others. Some pages had thick gutters, while other pages only had one image. The stylistic approach of Mary Shelley seemed almost entirely opposite to Crotchy's. While Auschwitz maintained order and formulation, Frankenstein appears almost chaotic. Every page is unpredictable, with images and colors flying everywhere. Shelley wants to build a suspenseful and thrilling story. She exaggerates the colors and frames to entertain the reader and connect us with the characters. Unlike Frankenstein, Auschwitz does not exaggerate the tone. Instead, it captures the true reality of the Holocaust to give the reader a feeling of what it was like to be there. Now, when we place these two images side by side, we are able to see how both authors depict good from evil. What is most interesting is their use of darkness to depict the antagonist. This is one of our first encounters with the monster. When he breaks through Frankenstein's window after just being created, we are immediately giving this shocking sense of fear. We see shadows and darkness sprawled across his body. Almost his whole body is hidden except for the highlighted muscles and glowing eyes that seemingly pierce through the page. Even the gutters and borders are all in black. Shelley uses this vivid contrast between light and dark to give the monster a mysterious presence and supernatural feel. His face is deliberately hidden, and we fear the unknown. On the other hand, Crotchy uses darkness to a completely different extent. This scene takes place when the Jewish prisoners are being lined up to be sent to the gas chambers. As Auschwitz is based on historical events, Crotchy's illustrations use darkness to show the reality of the atrocious German guards. Crotchy does not hide their face, but instead uses dark strokes to detail every wrinkle, every bone, every strand of hair on their face. The sketchwork appears almost rigid and sharp at times. We feel the true brutality of the Nazis that tortured and murdered the Jewish people 80 years ago, and we despise them for it. As we see, both authors use darkness to depict the antagonist differently. Shelley uses darkness to hide the face of the monster, giving it a supernatural presence, while Crotchy uses it to bring out reality. What is interesting is that both authors use camera angles and soft color tones to depict the victimized protagonist here. You see, In the same image, we see that young Frankenstein is slumped in his bed. He is in a defenseless position and is clearly seen as overpowered by the monster. The camera angle is the same as Frankenstein's perspective, as it looks up toward the beast. In Auschwitz, the prisoners also look up towards the Nazis as well, as you can see in this panel. As well, we can also see that the protagonists are drawn with softer and lighter color tones. You see that he's wearing a white and blue shirt, and the women here are drawn with almost gray clothes. The author clearly does this to signify their weakness and insignificance. However, Croce goes further to show the reality of the Jewish prisoners being treated as objects. We see that in this panel, the camera angle only focuses on their feet to emphasize how they are indistinguishable and have no identity. Even their faces are muted and to blend in with everyone else. As we see, both authors use similar techniques to make us sympathize with the characters and sympathize with the protagonists. However, later in the book, we see a large transition in the novel of Frankenstein. After learning about the monster's past and his only urge to be loved, we surprisingly develop pity for him. Shelley demonstrates this by presenting him in a slouched position, with softer color tones along his body. He also has lost the supernatural yellow glow in his eyes, and he appears almost vulnerable. The author suddenly makes the monster's character much more complex than it seems, and we wonder whether we judged him too soon. By simply drawing the monster with a different emphasis, Shelley successfully builds an entirely new personality and creates an emotional transition for the reader. Thus, both these graphic novels succeeded in telling their story brilliantly. Auschwitz maintains its realism so that we can empathize with the Holocaust victims to make us more aware of ourselves. And Frankenstein creates a gripping story that keeps the reader on edge. Alas, these stories seem so different, and yet there is still some overlap within the author's techniques.